Hello, folks. Thank you for tuning in with your charismatic host on another episode of the Federalist Files. We're going through Federalist number 61. It is titled The Same Subject Continued Concerning the Power of Congress to Regulate the Election of Members. It's written by Alexander Hamilton, February 26th, 1788. Topics include local and federal elections should be held at the same time. Inconsistency in the House of Representatives could cause more instability and higher chance of tyrannical government actions. So this one's really short. Generally, he goes over how now the dissenters, their new opinion is these elections, they want it to be in the county of the electors. And Hamilton he goes ahead, or rather, Hamilton confronts the claim that these elections should be held in the county of the electors. Hamilton contends that only voters from the county will be able to come out and vote, thus alienating a vast majority of the voters. And then, he kind of goes into a little bit how his dissenters felt that the federal government was going to impede on the state government's rights and the people's rights themselves by codifying that elections should take place in specific places, and that would disenfranchise people. So he kind of goes in. It's a little combination of everything, and then at the very end, he goes into how federal representatives should be elected or be held. The election should be held at the same time that state representatives are held as well. So he starts off, he states, and I quote, "The more candid opposers of the provision respecting elections contained in the plan of the convention, when pressed in argument, will sometimes concede the propriety of that provision, with this qualification, however, that it ought to have been accompanied with a declaration that all elections should be had in the counties where the electors resided. This, say they, was a necessary precaution against an abuse of the power." End quote. So the reason why his dissenters thought that there should be a declaration stating that all elections should be held in the counties where the electors also resided, his answer, and this was as a safeguard against the federal government getting involved. But then Hamilton's claim is, well, the state government has the same amount of power. They can also get involved and mess around with elections in that way to disenfranchise people. And additionally, this wouldn't be fair for everybody that lived outside of these counties. So he goes on next, he states, and I quote, "If those who are inclined to consult their jealous only would exercise it in a careful inspection of the several state constitutions, they would find little less room for disquietude and alarm for the latitude which most of them allowed in respect to elections, than from that latitude which is proposed to be allowed to the national government in the same respect." End quote. So he's saying, okay, so let's compare the state constitutions themselves to the federal constitutions, pretty much, stating a lot of these state constitutions don't have any provision about the locality of the elections, and the federal constitution really doesn't either. So to use an example, he goes on to talk about New York a little bit. So he states, "The Constitution of New York makes no other provision for locality of elections than that the members of the assembly shall be elected in the counties, those of the Senate in the great districts into which the state is or may be divided. These at present are 4 in number, and comprehend each from 2 to 6 counties. It may readily be perceived that it would not be more difficult to the legislature of New York to defeat the suffrages of the citizens of New York by confining elections to particular places than for the legislature of the United States to defeat the suffrages of the citizens of the Union by the like expedient." End quote. So here what he's saying, well, who's to say that the legislature of New York was to go on to disenfranchise, or rather he uses the term defeat the suffrages of the citizens of New York. So who's to say that the state legislature in New York wouldn't do the same thing as what's feared from the federal government right now at this point? And he's not, and what Hamilton's point really is he's not for the federal government having this power, and there's nothing actually in the provision in the Constitution that says that the federal government has an exclusive power to hold elections only in the counties where the electors are. So he's stating to begin with, I'm not a fan of this policy, but there's nothing in the federal government saying that they have the power to do it, and there's nothing in the state in this state constitution in New York saying they have the power to do it either. So you would make the assumption the Constitution is a positive document. It states only what the federal government has in power, the Union has in power. Other than that, everything else that's left out of that document means that that federal government does not have that power. So if the federal government doesn't have the specific right or the power to do this written down in the Constitution, then it does not have the power. It can't be construed any other way. And I think that's really what he's saying. And just to remember, that's another thing to remember about the Constitution is the Constitution states the government's rights in a positive way, meaning whatever's in the Constitution, that is the right that they have. If anything is left out of the Constitution, like if you think that the government somehow has a power or a policy to say that the people themselves have to walk around with green shirts every single Monday, it's not stated specifically in the federal Constitution anything even of the sort that they can regulate what people wear on a daily basis. It's kind of like the whole mask policy. So next he goes on, and I quote, "Suppose, for instance, the city of Albany was to be appointed the sole place of election, or the county and district of which it is a part. Would not the inhabitants of that city speedily become the only electors of the members both of the Senate and Assembly for that county and district?" End quote. So what he's asking is, imagine the city of Albany was appointed with the sole place of election for the county and the district. So let's say Albany, let's say all of New York, right? Let's say they had, 3 representatives allocated. And in the area of Albany, there's a couple electors there. But all around Albany, there's other towns, districts, what have you, or towns, municipalities that are still within that same district. If you held only one election, you held the election at only one place in Albany, that would disenfranchise, that would defeat the suffrages of all of the citizens that are in that specific district. So that's just him stating that as an example, that really the people that live in Albany would be the only people that would vote. Thus, it would defeat the suffrages of everyone else around the area that's still in that same district. So Hamilton explains that inconvenient distance will deter voters from going to vote. Hamilton argues if this provision were constituted in state elections, then the argument against the federal power to regulation elections is justified. So he's pretty much saying, yeah, this argument makes sense if there was something actually constituted in the state elections, in the state governments, where they were doing the same thing, but there really isn't anything of the sort. So this really isn't a valid argument, and it's kind of what they call a red herring, I guess you would say. It's like a fallacious argument where you're interpreting this specific statute in the Constitution, and you're interpreting it as giving the federal government more power than it actually, and that's something that actually commonly goes on now, where people just look at the Constitution, for example, Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia, that part everyone says, well, well-regulated means the government has the right to regulate it. And we've already gone over this. I think it was Federalist number 29 where we talked about it. The federal government actually was supposed to supply the militia and somewhat train them to an extent. And well-regulated means to actually, in that case, to make them better, not to push heavy regulations and shut down the ownership of firearms. And I just think it's a very funny distinction because the perspective of our founders comparatively to the perspective that we have now in the corporate media is just, it's so different. It's a complete 180 of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, the founders thought, okay, federal government had to supply the militia, they had to supply them, train them, but the state governments themselves had the power to kind of appoint people into positions, so you gave the loyalty of the militia was to the state itself. And well-regulated didn't mean we're putting heavy, provisions on the right to not only. I had a buddy that listens to the podcast. He messaged me about this. I was talking about the Second Amendment in my last, I think it was my last paper, my last current event. He was saying, yeah, but there's also, you got to remember this too, the right to, and this is talking about concealed carry permits, the right to keep and also bear arms, and that's a very important distinction too as well. Bear arms as in you can have them on your persons. So we're gonna go on next. How is it that the state representatives are less impressionable to the lust of power than federal government representatives? Oh no. Okay, so he says that next, but his next quote about the inconvenient distance from the electors, he states, and I quote, "When the place of election is at an inconvenient distance from the elector, the effect upon his conduct will be the same whether the distance be 20 miles or 20,000 miles. Hence it must appear that objections to the particular modification of the federal power of regulating elections will, in substance, apply with equal force to the modification of the like power in the Constitution of the state. And for this reason it will be impossible to acquit the one and to condemn the other. A similar comparison would lead to the same conclusion in respect to the constitutions of most of the other states." End quote. So here, just specifically, he's saying, and at that time, 20 miles was a very far distance. 20 miles now, if you had to think about it, in a car, you can make 20 miles in 15, 20 minutes, depending on where you're driving on the road. But 20 miles and 20,000 miles, he's saying this would disenfranchise people. People are not going to go out and vote because it would take them way too long to get there. So then next, he kind of goes on to talk about how the state representatives, how are they less impressionable to the lust of power than the federal government representatives. And he actually points out a very important argument where he states, and I quote, "If they cannot do this, they ought at least to prove to us that it is easier to subvert the liberties of 3 millions of people with the advantage of local governments to head their opposition than of 200,000 people who are destitute of that advantage." End quote. So this is a very important, very significant part here. What he's saying is, so how are the federal representatives going to overstep their power when you have 3 million people, because at this time, this is how many people were in the Union. You had 3 million people, along with their local governments and their state governments, to head the opposition against the federal government overstepping their power. Whereas with a state government, for example, I guess he was using, I don't know, let's say just per se New York in this case, 200,000 people lived in New York. If the state government wanted to overstep their boundaries and move around elections, and you didn't have this provision here, you would have 200,000 people that have no answer. 200,000 people would be disenfranchised or what have you. They're subverting the liberties of these 200,000 people, and there's no answer because really in a state you have your state government. I guess maybe you can go to your local municipality, but it doesn't hold the same power as a state government versus a federal government. And that's kind of what he's going on to say is if you think that the federal government's going to subvert the liberties of the people, then who's to say the state government isn't? The body of people is even smaller, so the opposition is going to be a lot less in a state. So Hamilton, next, he begs the rhetorical question, how is it that the federal government would be able to take the liberties of 3 million citizens with the foundation of local governments to propel dissensions, while state government will not be able to take the rights from 200,000 people with no supplemental support coming from the side of the people? It's just a better way to put it. So Hamilton, next, he asserts that his opponents should also explain, and I quote, "In relation to the point immediately under consideration, they ought to convince us that it is less probable that a predominant faction in a single state should, in order to maintain its superiority, incline to a preference of a particular class of electors, than that a similar spirit should take possession of the representatives of 13 states, spread over a vast region and in several respects distinguishable from each other by a diversity of local circumstances, prejudices, and interests." End quote. So this is actually something you kind of saw in New York. If you've ever seen that Gangs of New York movie, the mayor in that movie, I think his last name is Mayor Tweed. I'm pretty sure he was a Democrat. He was extremely corrupt in New York. So really the example here is if you have a faction of people that all kind of, it's majority rule, mob rule like scenario like you had in New York at that time with that mayor, you're stuffing the ballot box, you're doing whatever illegal things you have to do to become the mayor in that case. And he was known to be very corrupt with businesses. I think he would pretty much launder their money. He was doing all these weird, all these illegal activities. But how are you going to subvert the liberties of the people? Because throughout the entire Union at this time, you have 13 states, you have all different people, different circumstances. There's a lot of diversity here. So how are you going to have the same mob rule in the federal government than you are in the state. In the state, it's much more reasonable to have a mob rule like scenario. For example, i.e., if you go down south, at the time when they held slaves, that was it. That was the majority rule. Federally, you saw that it wasn't possible to continue that because there were the corrupt few that were in the South, and they couldn't take over because there was not a majority, there was not a mob rule by the South over the North. The North had so much more of a population. So next he goes on. He states, hitherto, my observations have only aimed at a vindication of the provision in question on the ground of theoretic propriety, on that of the danger of placing the power elsewhere, and on that of the safety of placing it in the manner proposed. But there remains to be mentioned a positive advantage which will result from this disposition, and which could not as well have been obtained from any other, end quote. So he's going to kind of go on to say the positives of this provision. So in summation, he asks, how is the state election system under this provision not considered fallacious, but the former provision of the federal government to regulate elections when needed is somehow tyrannical? So that's from the last quote. But Hamilton emphasizes that because the length of distance between the federal representatives and the population of the country, it is much more of a safeguard to afford the power to the federal government, whereas a state government, considering the amount of land and population, it is not. The collusion would have to be pervasive throughout the country, whereas in a state, the corruption wouldn't have to be as widespread or of the same magnitude. So that's just based off the last quote that I stated before this one. But he's going to go on to talk about the uniformity of elections, and that's what he was alluding to in the very last quote. So he goes on next to state, and I quote, I allude to the circumstances of uniformity in the time of elections for the Federal House of Representatives. It is more than possible that this uniformity may be found by experience to be of great importance to the public welfare, both as a security against the perpetuation of the same spirit in the body and as a cure for the diseases of faction. If each state may choose its own time of election, it is possible there may be at least as many different periods as there are months in the year. The times of election in the several states, as they are now established for local purposes, vary between extremes as wide as March and November, end quote. This is a pretty significant quote here. So what he's talking about is if you have elections where New Jersey, it's in March, and then it's November in New York, and all over the place, every single state, if they vary these pretty substantial time periods from one state to another, then you're going to have this idea of, or perpetuation of the same spirit of the body. So the way that I could best explain this is if you're in a workplace, right, and you are a new person in that workplace, and there's only a few of you new people that come in, and there's a bad atmosphere. It's a negative atmosphere, adverse, just a terrible place to work because the people that work there already have those bad spirits. Then you kind of adopt it when you go into the workplace. Human beings kind of adapt to the conditions that they're in. A lot of them like to be followers rather than be independent. That's just the general case. It's the whole sheep in the herd mentality, and that's generally how most people are. Not all of them, but most of them are. And then there's the anomalies that stand out and stand up against the negative narratives. So in this case, what you would have is you would have people come into the House of Representatives at all these different times, that the negative cancerous person that's there, or a group of people, it would spread very quickly. And then when one person comes in to a House of Representatives of 60 people, that one person is pretty much converted to that negativity that's in that same body, that negative spirit, as he says. So he goes on. And that's why he would much rather have, every 2 years you have your election and people are changing spots, and then everything's more consistent. Everyone's kind of coming into a new system. Everything's kind of like a fresh start. So it goes on, he states next, and I quote, the consequence of this diversity would be that there could never happen a total dissolution or renovation of the body at one time. If an improper spirit of any kind should happen to prevail in it, that spirit would be apt to infuse itself into the new members as they come forward in succession. The mass would be likely to remain nearly the same, assimilating constantly to itself its gradual accretions. So this is exactly what I was saying, but much bigger words, really. He said the consequence of having this diversity, having one person get elected in March, one person get elected in November, if an improper spirit, as in like a negative, terrible atmosphere, were to preside in this body at any time, it would prevail, because it would infuse itself into the new members as they come forward right after being elected. And then the mass would likely remain nearly the same, and it would spread like cancer throughout the House of Representatives. So he contends with no uniformity in election. If time were to be determined by the state governments, the House of Representatives would be elected at different times of the year. In other words, Hamilton fears that newly elected representatives will assimilate to the same thinking of the mass of the rest of the House, and if the intentions of the consensus were to be improper, it would infect new representatives, thus causing concern for tyranny and usurpations of power. So just an example of this, if you really think about it, you have Marjorie Taylor Greene came in, as well as, I think her name's Laura or Lauren Boebert. Laura Boebert is like, super Second Amendment, pro-Second Amendment. Marjorie Taylor Greene is pretty conservative, pretty right-wing. And when they came in, they were, aside from all the Marjorie Taylor Greene, QAnon stuff, they're pretty conservative. They're pretty outspoken in the very beginning. They haven't been as outspoken, I've noticed. And that's because the Republicans that are in the House of Representatives, you start to adopt the culture of whatever party you're in. And that's kind of the problem with party politics. So the Republicans, in a general sense, are super soft. So both of them coming out hard, railing against the Democrats and their leftist agenda. At first, it's like, oh my God, they're so outlandish, and then you have other people that are in the Republican Party that are in the House of Reps, not people that give their opinion segments. People like me on the conservative side, not people like us. We don't condemn or go against those people. But you have people that are hacks that are in the Republican Party that are in the House of Representatives and don't stand up for their fellow colleagues. And that's really how it ends up working. That's how you become silenced. That's how this whole group mentality, this group think works. And that's why if you notice in the House of Representatives, the Democrats are always standing up for each other, and that's why their group ideology is always stronger. You notice the Republicans are very weak and they don't stand up for each other. And that's kind of the reason why there is no unity in the Republican Party side. You have a bunch of really soft, like Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy comes out and reads Green Eggs and Ham after that whole debacle with Dr. Seuss. They just do wishy-washy, soft things. It would be edgy if he were to read the books that got taken off of Amazon, but he wouldn't do that, of course. So to go on here, he's got two more quotes. He states next, and I quote, "Uniformity in the time of elections seems not less requisite for executing the idea of a regular rotation in the Senate and for conveniently assembling the legislature at a stated period in each year. It may be asked, why then could not a time have been fixed in the Constitution, as the most zealous adversaries of the plan of the convention in this state are, in general, not less zealous admirers of the Constitution of the state? The question may be retorted, and it may be asked, why was not a time for the like purpose fixed in the Constitution of this state?" End quote. So all that he's really going on to say is these adversaries of his plan, these conventions in the states, why is it that they don't have any fixed proposed constitutional amendment in their own state that lays out these provisions themselves? So it's pretty much just calling them hypocrites. He's saying, well, why does the state constitution not have anything to say about this if you guys are so concerned about it? So next he goes on, this is the very last quote. "No better answer can be given than that it was a matter which might safely be entrusted to legislative discretion, and that if a time had been appointed, it might upon experiment have been found less convenient than some other time. The same answer may be given to the question put on the other side, and it may be added that the supposed danger of a gradual change being merely speculative, it would have been hardly advisable upon that speculation to establish as a fundamental point what would deprive several states of the convenience of having the election for their own governments and for the national government at the same epochs, end quote. So here actually what he's talking about, and specifically, is why is it that this wasn't fixed in the constitution of the state? And then he also says, there's other people that the dissenters were saying before, why is it that there is not a specific time of assembling in the federal constitution for voting? That's what his dissenters are saying. And he says, oh, all right, well, why isn't there anything in the state constitution either? And then he goes on, the reason that we have this system this way, where there's no stated specific time, is then the difficulties of, if this was federally amended in the Constitution, the difficulties of changing this around, it would be very, we need to leave it kind of open, where all you need really is a majority type vote in the House and the Senate. If you had to go through a federal amendment every single time you wanted to change the times and the dates of the elections, then it would just never happen, because then you'd have to have 75% of state legislatures agree on it, along with 2/3 of the Congress agree on it as well. So it's kind of better to just keep it open and have these gradual changes, because there's going to be situations are always ever changing. It's not always the same. It really does. It makes very good sense. I don't even know why that was even an argument, to be honest with you. It keeps it open. It leaves it open for action, such as if you look at declaring war, there's the specific declaring war, and there's also executive actions that can be taken through the military that's not technically considered declaring war. If you had to go through the Congress every single time you wanted to declare war, or not, rather, carry out any military operation such as Osama bin Laden, of killing Osama bin Laden, if you had to go through the Congress for that, first thing is it'd be way too late. It would take way too long. And then second, you have a bunch of people in Congress that might rat or go and talk to the news media, and then it gets leaked over to Pakistan, and then bin Laden would have fled. So it's kind of good in some ways that you leave that all open. So this gives the federal government not only a better ability to organize against the people, but it also gives them more of a propensity for tyrannical action. Hamilton concludes the states should have their own government elections along with the national government elections at the same time. This also holds less of a cost on the public treasury to hold all elections at the same time. So that'll really conclude this one. He's pretty much just saying states should be running their own elections, specifics on dates and stuff. Everything should kind of be the same. The federal government should have a say in that a little bit, but we shouldn't do constitutional amendments. But these are all things that really aren't highly contested or debatable now. The federal government right now, what they're trying to do is they're trying to mainline state elections and federal elections all through the federal government, which is directly unconstitutional. But in terms of when the date is of the elections, no one really fights or contests this on either party. This is actually something that kind of is bipartisan agreement on. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. That will conclude this episode. Please like, share, subscribe, drop the mic, let people know about the podcast, and make sure you continue to tune into the Current Event podcast. Those have been picking up steam, and they've been doing very well. I greatly appreciate it, and I will see you next time.